The buzzards had been circling for 3 days, their shadows wheeling across the cracked earth like harbingers of death. Ellie pressed her cracked lips together, counting the dark shapes overhead, 6 of them, one for each child, lying motionless in the merciless Arizona sun. "Sleep now, my little desert flower." Her mother's voice echoed from a memory just 3 nights old when Becca had sung that lullaby while braiding Ellie's hair by candlelight. "Tomorrow we'll find somewhere safe, I promise." But promises, Ellie had learned, were like desert mirages, beautiful, until you got close enough to see they were nothing but lies. Tommy, barely 4 years old, pressed against her side, his breathing shallow as paper. The twins, Ruth and Rebecca, had stopped crying yesterday, their small bodies curled like wilted flowers. Samuel, her 8-year-old brother, kept whispering for water, with lips cracked like old leather. Only Mary, at 10, still had strength to squeeze Ellie's hand when the fear got too bad. The red dust tasted of copper and despair. Around them, the Sonoran desert stretched endlessly saguaro cacti, standing like ancient sentinels, their arms raised to a sky that showed no mercy. Somewhere in this wasteland, their mother had abandoned them with nothing but torn blankets and that terrible last look over her shoulder eyes, full of something that might have been love or might have been guilt. "I promise." Ellie whispered to Tommy the same words her mother had used. But unlike Mama, she meant them. She was 14, old enough to know the world was cruel, but young enough to believe that determination could overcome anything. If death wanted her family, it would have to fight her for them. The paint horse materialized through the heat shimmer like an answer to prayer. Its rider was tall and weathered, moving with the careful grace of a man who'd learned that survival meant watching every shadow. Jonas Clay had been hunting snakes in these badlands for 15 years, following trails that led him through country decent folks avoided. "Easy now," he said, dismounting with deliberate calm. His voice carried the rasp of desert wind. "Nobody's gonna hurt you." Jonas had been tracking a nest of diamondbacks for a week, following sign through the maze of canyons that cut through this corner of Arizona territory. Snake hunting paid well. Bootmakers in Tucson would trade silver for diamondback hide, and doctors needed the venom for their medicines. More importantly, it was work that kept a man moving, never staying in one place long enough for the law to catch up. He'd been running for 2 years now, ever since he'd killed Sheriff Morrison in what was supposed to be a routine arrest. Self-defense. But Morrison's family had money and influence. Sometimes justice wasn't about right and wrong. Sometimes it was about who could afford the better lawyers. The children were so still at first that Jonas almost mistook them for bundles of rags. Then the oldest girl raised her head, and he saw eyes that held too much pain and too much fierce love for someone so young. It reminded him of his sister Anna, the way she'd looked during those final fever-racked hours when he was barely 16 and too poor to afford a doctor. "Please," Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible over the desert wind. "I promised I wouldn't let them die alone." Something in her words, the way she held the younger children, even as her own strength failed, made Jonas think of Anna's last breath and the promise he'd made at her graveside to help people when he could, to be better than the hard place that had shaped him. "What's your name, girl?" "Ellie. Ellie Hartwell." She studied his face with startling intensity. "Are you going to take us away from here?" "Yes," Jonas said, and meant it. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe." Loading 6 half-dead children into his supply wagon was like handling spun glass. Tommy burned with fever, mumbling words that might have been prayers or might have been their mother's name. The twins were barely conscious, their small bodies limp as cloth dolls. Samuel kept asking questions with the desperate hope of a child who still believed adults could fix anything. "Where's our mama?" he asked as Jonas lifted him into the wagon bed. Jonas met Ellie's eyes, seeing the terrible understanding there. She was smart enough to read truth in silence, brave enough to hope he was wrong. "We'll look for her," Jonas said, because sometimes kindness mattered more than honesty. 3 miles ahead of them, Becca Hartwell stumbled through the desert like a woman possessed by demons. She'd been walking since dawn, driven by guilt that gnawed at her insides like a living thing. The plan had seemed simple when Frank Grimm's men explained it. Bring the children to Dead Horse Canyon, walk away, and her husband's gambling debts would be forgiven. No questions, no consequences. But when the moment came, she couldn't watch strange men load her babies into wagons bound for Mexican brothels and mining camps. So she'd run cutting herself on cactus thorns to fake an attack, hoping the desert would claim her before the guilt could eat her alive. The desert had other plans. Slade found her collapsed beside a dry creek bed, her dress torn to ribbons, and her feet bloody from walking over stones. He was built like a grizzly bear with scars covering his face from fights that had taught him to enjoy inflicting pain on others. Well, well, he drawled, dismounting with predatory grace. Look what the wind blew in. Behind him rode Carlos, whose knife had settled arguments from El Paso to Phoenix, and Pete, a nervous man whose hands shook unless he was killing something. They'd been searching for Becca since yesterday, following orders from their boss. Por favor. Carlos said mockingly, the jefe wants to see you, señora. He has questions about your niños. Slade hauled her upright with one massive hand. See, we got ourselves a problem. Word is somebody found those brats before our buyers could collect them. Some snake hunter with more heart than sense. Becca's chest clenched. They're alive. For now. But here's what's going to happen. Slade's scarred face split into a grin that held no warmth. You're going to clean yourself up and tell everyone that man kidnapped your children. Stole them right from their beds like the animal he is. I won't. The backhand sent her sprawling blood streaming from her split lip. Pete giggled nervously while Carlos cleaned his fingernails with a wickedly sharp blade. You will, Slade continued, or we'll kill them slow. All 6 while you watch. Then we'll sell what's left to whoever'll pay coin. 20 miles away, Jonas was learning that the desert saved its cruelest surprises for when you thought safety was within reach. The sandstorm hit without warning, a wall of brown fury that turned day to night in heartbeats. Wind howled like tortured souls, and visibility dropped to arm's length. Get down! Jonas shouted over the roar, fighting to control his spooked horse. They worked together in desperate silence, Jonas using hard-won experience, while Ellie showed surprising strength for someone so young. The wagon's canvas tarp became their shelter, but sand found every gap, every weakness. The younger children began coughing, their weakened bodies unable to handle another assault. That's when Jonas remembered his father's lessons about surviving in country that didn't want you to live. Water was life, and sometimes you had to find it where other men wouldn't think to look. He found the 3 rattlers he'd killed that morning, their bodies still holding precious moisture. With his skinning knife, he cut into the first snake, squeezing drops of fluid into Ellie's cupped palms. What are you doing? She asked, watching him work. Something my pa taught me before the fever took him, Jonas said. Every living thing in the desert holds water if you know how to find it. They worked through the storm's fury, Jonas cutting, while Ellie distributed the life-giving moisture to each child. It was grim work, but it kept them breathing when the wind tried to steal their lives. When the storm finally passed, they emerged covered in sand, but alive. More importantly, Tommy's fever had broken, and his eyes were clear for the first time in days. How did you know? Ellie asked, wiping dust from her brother's face. Jonas was quiet for a moment, remembering his father's patient voice during their last hunting trip together. Pa used to say the desert keeps its secrets buried deep, but if you listen close enough, it'll teach you what you need to survive. As they loaded the children back into the wagon, neither Jonas nor Ellie noticed the figure watching them from a distant ridge. A man with a deputy marshal's badge who'd been following Jonas Clay's trail for months, waiting for the right moment to close his trap. Red Mesa squatted on the desert floor like a collection of bleached bones, its buildings clustered around a central plaza, where a dry fountain served as a monument to failed dreams. The town had been built on silver hopes that played out years ago, leaving behind drifters, gamblers, and folks with nowhere else to run. Every year during the summer solstice, the townspeople observed the Festival of Desert Lights, hanging lanterns throughout the streets to honor those who disappeared in the wasteland surrounding them. It was their one moment of community in a place where trust was as rare as water. Frank Grimm owned most of the town, now ruling from behind the sheriff's desk, with soft hands and hard eyes. He'd been a preacher once before the war, and his first taste of easy money had shown him that sermons were less profitable than schemes. Money is the only true gospel in this wilderness. He often said, a twisted echo of his former calling. Everything else is just pretty words for fools. He sat behind his desk, now studying the woman Slade had brought in. Becca Hartwell looked like she'd crawled through hell-torn dress, sunburned skin eyes, hollow with exhaustion and something deeper. But she was coherent enough to tell the story Grimm needed to hear. He came in the night like a demon. She sobbed words carefully rehearsed. Said young ones brought good money across the border. When I tried to stop him, he beat me and left me to die. Grimm made notes with a preacher's careful penmanship. This Jonas Clay, you'd recognize him again. I'll never forget his face. Tall man, lean as a coyote riding a paint horse. Had winter in his eyes and cruelty in his smile. Behind Becca's chair, Slade nodded approval. The story was simple enough to be believable, detailed enough to justify harsh measures. Perfect for Grimm's purposes. Mrs. Hartwell. Grimm said, his voice smooth as snake oil. I want you to know we'll move heaven and earth to find your children and see this monster hang. The truth was more complex. Grimm had been expecting those children to disappear, quietly sold to Mexican buyers who understood that questions led to bullets. It was profitable work. Unwanted orphans brought good money south of the border, and territorial authorities never looked too hard when children went missing from places like Red Mesa. But now, complications threatened his careful plans. A snake hunter who'd stumbled into the wrong canyon at the wrong time, and 6 children who should have been in chains by now. If word spread about his real business, it might attract attention from people with badges and principles. ¿Qué hacemos, jefe? Carlos asked after Becca had been taken to the hotel. When Clay arrives, and he will if he's got those children, we arrest him for kidnapping. Grimm replied. Let the grieving mother identify him, and that's the end of Jonas Clay's story. And after Slade's scarred face split into an anticipatory grin. Frontier justice moved swiftly. Shame if he tried to escape before we could arrange a proper trial. 5 miles outside town, Jonas pulled the wagon to a halt, studying Red Mesa through his spyglass. Something felt wrong about the place. Too quiet, too still, like a spider's web waiting for flies. There's the town, Ellie said, shading her eyes against the sun. Jonas studied the layout with a soldier's eye. 1 main street, buildings close together, limited escape routes. The church bell tower would give excellent fields of fire, and those alleys looked perfect for ambushes. Listen careful, he said to Ellie. If trouble starts, you take the children and run for that arroyo we passed a mile back. Don't look back, don't try to help me, just run. What kind of trouble? Before Jonas could answer, riders appeared on both sides of the road. 6 men with drawn weapons, led by the biggest, ugliest son of a bitch Jonas had seen in recent memory. My Jonas Clay, Slade bellowed. You're under arrest for kidnapping. The children huddled together in the wagon bed, frightened by the sudden appearance of armed men. Jonas kept his hands visible, mind racing through possibilities. 6 against 1 with innocence to protect. The odds weren't promising. I think there's been a mistake, he said calmly. Found these children abandoned in the desert. Was bringing them here for help. Their mama tells a different story. Slade replied, his horse dancing closer. Says you stole them from their beds, planned to sell them like cattle to Mexican slavers. Cold certainty settled in Jonas's gut. A setup had to be. But who was pulling the strings and why? Step down from that wagon nice and slow. Jonas complied, watching for an opening that didn't come. These men moved like professionals, positioned to give each other clear fields of fire. As soon as his boots touched ground, two of them closed in to disarm him. "Leave him alone," Ellie shouted, jumping down from the wagon. "He saved us our mother." Slade's casual backhand sent her sprawling in the dust blood streaming from her split lip. Niños say foolish things when they're scared, Verdad. The sight of Ellie's blood triggered something primal in Jonas. He lunged forward, but Pete's rifle stock caught him behind the ear before he could reach Slade. Pain exploded through his skull, and darkness rushed in like a tide. "Chain him up," Slade ordered, "and get those children to the jail for their protection." As consciousness faded, Jonas heard Ellie promising her siblings that everything would be all right, the same words her mother had used before abandoning them. He tried to tell her to run, but the words wouldn't come. The Red Mesa jail was built like a fortress, with thick adobe walls and windows barely large enough for a man's fist. Jonas had been in enough cells to recognize the difference between law and the kind of authority men like Grimm dispensed from behind a badge. His cell was 8 feet by 6, with a straw mattress that had seen better decades, and a bucket that should have been emptied during the previous century. Through the barred window, he could see the children in the cell across the corridor, huddled together like frightened animals. "They keep asking when they can go home," Grimm said, settling into a chair outside Jonas's cell. "Breaks a man's heart, really? Poor little things don't understand the kind of monster they've been traveling with." Jonas tested his shackles, good steel professionally applied. "Where's their mother?" "Resting at the hotel. Poor woman's endured quite an ordeal thanks to you." Grimm lit a thin cigarillo, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like incense from his preaching days. "She told me everything, Clay. How you came in the darkness, how you beat her senseless when she tried to protect her babies. That's a lie. Is it because God has provided me with 6 traumatized children and a battered woman who say otherwise?" Grimm's eyes held the fervor of a fallen preacher. "Money may be the only true gospel, but sometimes even Scripture demands blood for blood." Jonas understood the threat. Grimm planned to have him killed while resisting arrest or some similar fiction. Clean, simple, no inconvenient witnesses. "What's your real game here, Grimm? This isn't about justice." Smart man sees through the performance. "You're right, this is about opportunity, about providence delivering profit into deserving hands." The sheriff leaned forward, his pale eyes reflecting lamplight like a serpent's. "I have buyers south of the border who pay premium prices for young merchandise. Especially girls, they're worth their weight in silver to the right customers." The casual way he said it made Jonas's blood freeze. "You're trafficking children." "I prefer to think of it as solving problems while serving the Lord's purpose. Mrs. Hartwell owed me money she couldn't pay her husband's gambling debts, you understand. Those children were going to starve anyway. This way, everyone benefits from God's plan." Across the corridor, Ellie pressed her face against the bars. "He's lying, Mr. Jonas. Our mama wouldn't never say such terrible things." Grimm stubbed out his cigarillo with deliberate care. "Children are remarkably adaptable creatures. Few months in their new homes, they'll forget all about this place." He stood smoothing his vest like he was preparing for Sunday service. "Storm's building again. Should provide excellent cover for your tragic escape attempt." After Grimm left, Jonas sat in the darkness, trying to think his way out of an impossible situation. The shackles were solid, the door was locked, and he was outnumbered by professional killers. Outside, he could hear wind beginning to build as another storm approached. That's when he noticed movement in the shadows, someone sliding something between the cells. Ellie had managed to reach through the bars, her thin arm just long enough to pass him a folded piece of paper. In the dim light, he could make out desperate handwriting. "They forced me to lie, or they'd kill you all. Grimm has buyers coming tomorrow night. Plans to make your death look like escape attempt. There's a doctor here, Morrison, who hates what Grimm does, but fears him. I left a file in your mattress when guards weren't watching. Can't undo my betrayal, but maybe you can save them. The Festival of Desert Lights is tomorrow. I've been leaving lanterns as signals for someone who might help. Look for the blue light. BH. Jonas felt around in the moldy straw until his fingers found the small file wrapped in cloth. Becca Hartwell, their mother. She'd been forced to betray her own children, but now she was risking everything to give them a chance. Your mama left this, he whispered to Ellie. The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. She came to see us earlier. Said she was sorry the bad men made her tell lies. Mr. Jonas, is she really our mama if she left us to die? It was a question that cut deep, reminding Jonas of his own failures. When Anna was dying, he'd left her bedside just once for 20 minutes to fetch water from the well. She'd died calling his name while he was gone. Sometimes good people get forced into impossible choices, he said finally. Doesn't make the choices right, but doesn't make the love any less real. Outside, the first drops of rain began pattering against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a blue lantern flickered like a beacon. Jonas started working on his chains with the hidden file, knowing he had until tomorrow night to break free, overpower Grimm's men, and get 6 children to safety. The storm building outside would either deliver them to salvation or bury their bones in the desert sand. But for the first time since his capture, Jonas Clay had something more dangerous than weapons or allies. He had hope and a 14-year-old girl who was planning something that would either save them all or get them killed. By midnight, the storm was hitting Red Mesa like the wrath of an angry god, turning the air into a whirling wall of sand and debris. The wind howled through the streets with enough force to lift grown men off their feet, and visibility had dropped to 0 beyond arm's length. Jonas had been working on his shackles for hours, the small file slowly eating through steel links. His wrists were raw and bleeding, but the metal was finally starting to part. Across the corridor, Ellie kept watch while her siblings slept, using a system of hand signals she developed to alert him to approaching guards. The jail had 2 guards tonight: Pete, who dozed fitfully in the front office with a bottle of whiskey, and Carlos, who made rounds every hour with increasingly unsteady steps. Both men seemed content to wait out the storm rather than venture into the chaos outside. "Donde está Slade?" Carlos muttered during his midnight check, taking another pull from his bottle. "Should be back by now with the wagon." The first shackle snapped just as Pete stumbled through the door to relieve his partner. Jonas quickly pulled his hands behind his back, hiding the broken chain, while the nervous gunman swayed in the doorway. "Still here, Clay." Pete's voice carried a slight stutter that worsened when he was drunk or frightened. "Don't worry. Tomorrow you take your last ride." He laughed at his own joke and shuffled back toward the office, leaving the prisoners in relative darkness. Jonas waited until he heard snoring before attacking the second shackle with renewed urgency. Breaking free was only the first challenge. He still had to get out of the cell, neutralize 2 armed guards, and evacuate 6 children in the middle of a sandstorm. The odds weren't promising, but they beat sitting still and waiting for execution. The second chain parted with a sharp crack that seemed loud as thunder in the confined space. Jonas rubbed circulation back into his hands, then examined the cell door lock. It was simple frontier design, sturdy, but not sophisticated. With the right pressure applied in the right place, the mechanism clicked open just as all hell broke loose outside. Slade kicked in the front door like an avenging demon, his coat whipping in the wind, and his scarred face twisted with rage. Behind him came 2 more of Grimm's men, all looking like they'd been wrestling with the storm and losing. "Donde están todos?" Slade roared in his mixture of English and Spanish, shaking Pete awake. "Jesus, boss. You scared me half to dead death. What you doing out in this weather?" "Grimm's orders, pendejo. Buyers moved up their schedule, want the merchandise delivered tonight, storm or no storm." Jonas felt ice flood his veins. They were out of time. Tonight, in this weather, money don't wait for good weather. Slade snarled, moving toward the cells. "Get those brats ready for transport." What about Clay? Slade drew his pistol with practiced ease. What about him? That's when Jonas made his move, slamming the cell door open with enough force to catch Slade off guard. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of the weapon, while Pete and Carlos scrambled for their guns. Slade was bigger and stronger, but Jonas was fighting for more than his own life. They rolled across the floor, crashing into furniture while the storm raged outside. Jonas managed to get both hands around Slade's throat, but the big man drove a knee into his wounded shoulder, breaking his grip with an explosion of pain. Matinlow. Slade gasped, but Pete's shot went wide as Jonas dove behind an overturned desk. Across the corridor, Ellie was working frantically at her cell door with a piece of wire she'd pulled from Jonas's hat during one of Carlos's earlier visits. Her brother Samuel helped his small fingers more nimble than hers as they manipulated their improvised lockpick. "I promise we'll get out," Ellie whispered to the twins, using the phrase that had become her anchor. "I promise." The lock clicked open just as Slade turned from his struggle with Jonas, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "¿A dónde van pequeños conejos?" he snarled, lunging toward the children's cell. But Jonas tackled him again, sending them both crashing through the office window in an explosion of glass and splintered wood. They hit the muddy street outside and rolled in the sand, immediately swallowed by the howling storm. Inside the jail, Ellie gathered her siblings with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning this moment for hours. "Stay together. Hold hands and don't let go," she shouted over the chaos. "Remember what I taught you about the desert. Follow the blue lights." They stumbled through the chaos as Pete and Carlos tried to cut them off. But the children were small and quick, able to duck under grasping hands and slip through narrow spaces. Ellie led them toward the back door, where a series of blue lanterns placed earlier by their mother marked a path through the storm. Outside, Jonas and Slade continued their vicious fight in near-zero visibility. Sand filled their mouths and eyes, making every breath a struggle. Jonas couldn't see more than inches, but he could feel Slade's massive hands reaching for his throat, could hear the man's curses in 2 languages over the wind. A gunshot cracked through the storm, and Jonas felt the bullet burn across his ribs. Slade had found his weapon again, but the wind and sand made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Jonas grabbed a handful of sand and flung it at where he thought Slade's face might be, then rolled sideways as another shot split the air. His groping hands found something solid, a piece of broken timber from a storm-damaged building. He swung it like a club, connecting with something that gave way, with a wet crunch. Slade screamed and fell backward, blood pouring from a gash that ran from his temple to his jaw. "Hijo de puta," Slade snarled, raising the gun again. But Jonas was already moving, using the storm as cover, to disappear into the swirling chaos. Behind him, he could hear Slade shouting for his men, trying to organize a search that would be nearly impossible in these conditions. The livery stable was already burning when Jonas found it flames licking at the wooden structure with hungry tongues. Through the sand and smoke, he could see Ellie and her siblings huddled behind a water trough, following the trail of blue lanterns their mother had left as guideposts through the chaos. Samuel went inside. Ellie shouted over the wind, pointing toward the inferno. "Said the horses could help us escape," Jonas cursed under his breath. The boy was trying to be a hero, but the stable was becoming a death trap. Through the flames, he could see horses screaming and rearing as they tried to escape their burning stalls. "Stay here," he told Ellie. "Whatever happens, don't move until I come back." He was halfway to the stable when Frank Grimm stepped out of the storm like a demon from hell, a shotgun in his hands, and the fervor of a fallen preacher blazing in his eyes. "End of the line, Clay. Time to face God's judgment." Jonas dove sideways as both barrels erupted in flame and thunder buckshot, shredding the air where he'd been standing. He rolled behind a horse trough as Grimm reloaded, his mind racing. 20 feet of open ground with no cover, too far to rush, too close to miss. But then young Samuel emerged from the burning stable, leading 2 horses and coughing smoke from his lungs. The brave boy saw Grim raising the reloaded shotgun and did something that changed everything. "Help us," Samuel screamed at the top of his voice. "The sheriff's trying to murder children." His cry carried over the wind, reaching the ears of every person in Red Mesa who'd come out to fight the fire. Heads turned, and suddenly Frank Grimm found himself facing a crowd of his own townspeople with a smoking shotgun pointed at a 12-year-old boy. "Now hold on," Grimm said, suddenly aware of how this looked. "This man is a dangerous criminal." "Oh, like hell he is," interrupted a voice from the crowd. Dr. Morrison pushed forward his weathered face, grim with long-suppressed anger. "We know what you've been doing, Frank. The trafficking, the bribes, using God's name to justify evil. You're speaking nonsense, old man. I serve the Lord's will in this wilderness. You serve money and power. Nothing more." The doctor's voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen too much suffering. "Explain why you were planning to ship 6 children across the border tonight. Explain the wagon waiting at the north end of town with drivers who speak no English." The crowd began to murmur angrily, and Grimm realized his carefully constructed authority was crumbling like sand. These people had tolerated his corruption because it brought order and profit. But child trafficking crossed a line even they wouldn't accept. "Stand down, Frank," called Mayor Jackson, his voice shaking but determined. "Put that gun down and we'll sort this out proper." But Grimm was beyond reason now, his preacher's mind twisted by years of justifying evil as God's will. Instead of surrendering, he grabbed the nearest child, little Ruth, one of the twins, and pressed the shotgun barrel to her head. "Back away," he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "All of you, the Lord demands sacrifice, and I'll send this little lamb to heaven right here." The crowd froze in horror, watching their sheriff use a 6-year-old as a human shield. Ruth whimpered in terror, her small hands clutching at Grimm's arm. "Let her go," Jonas said, stepping into the open with his hands raised. "Your fight's with me. My fight is with sin itself." Grimm's eyes blazed with fanatic fervor. "You corrupted these innocent souls, and now they must be purified." The standoff stretched like a held breath. Grimm with his hostage, the townspeople with their shocked faces, Jonas caught between justice and desperation. Then the storm delivered its final surprise. Frank Grimm. The voice came from behind the crowd, calm and authoritative despite the chaos. A man stepped forward, and Jonas felt his world tilt sideways. Deputy Marshal Tom Morrison badge glinting despite the storm, his gun trained not on Jonas, but on Grimm. "You're under arrest for human trafficking and corruption of office." Jonas stared in disbelief. Tom Morrison, brother of the sheriff he'd killed in Tucson, the man who'd been hunting him for 2 years. But instead of revenge in his eyes, Jonas saw something else entirely. "What the hell are you doing here, Tom?" Grimm demanded, his grip tightening on Ruth. "Following a trail that led me straight to your door," Morrison replied grimly. "Been tracking Clay here for months, but I've been watching your operation even longer. Seen enough to know who the real criminal is." Jonas found his voice. "You've been following me since Tucson. Wanted to bring you in for killing my brother." Morrison's eyes never left Grimm. "But I learned some things along the way. Found evidence about the bribes Frank was taking the children who disappeared under his watch. My brother was dirty, but he didn't deserve to die for it. He was going to hang me for crimes I didn't commit," Jonas said. "I know. Found the real evidence after you ran doctored bills of sale, forged witness statements, payments from Grimm's account. Frank here was running a trafficking network through 3 territories using my brother's badge to make it legal." Grimm's face had gone white as desert bone. His network of corruption was unraveling thread by thread, and everyone could see it happening. "Doesn't matter now." Morrison continued, his voice steady as stone. "You killed a lawman, even a dirty one. That's got to be answered for. But first, we're going to save these children. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, everyone frozen in the eye of the storm. Then Slade appeared out of the swirling chaos, like a blood-soaked nightmare, his face a ruin of cuts, and his clothes torn by wind and glass. "Jefe," he bellowed, stumbling forward with his gun drawn. I got the wagon ready, but Slade was half blind from his injuries and completely disoriented by the storm. He fired at what he thought was a threat, but the bullet took Mayor Jackson in the shoulder, instead spinning the man around and sending him crashing to the muddy ground. The crowd scattered screaming as more shots filled the air. In the confusion, Jonas lunged forward, tackling Grim and knocking little Ruth clear of danger. The shotgun discharged skyward, its blast lost in the storm's roar. They rolled in the mud, fighting for control while chaos erupted around them. Grim was smaller, but desperate, clawing at Jonas's eyes while trying to bring a hideout gun to bear. Around them, Morrison and the townspeople exchanged shots with Slade and what remained of his gang. "You've destroyed everything." Grim shrieked, his preacher's voice cracking with rage. Years of God's work ruined. Pain exploded through Jonas's body as Grim's knee found his wounded shoulder. But he held on, thinking of Anna, of every child he'd failed to save. Not these children. Not today. But then disaster struck with the force of divine wrath. A massive burning timber fell from the collapsing stable, crashing down like the hammer of God himself. Jonas threw himself sideways, but the huge beam caught his legs, pinning him beneath its crushing weight while flames licked hungrily at his clothes. Grim scrambled free, his face triumphant as he retrieved his scattered weapons. "Even the Lord's fire serves my purpose, Snake Hunter." Jonas struggled against the timber, but it was hopeless. The beam was too heavy, his position too awkward, and the flames were spreading fast. Grim raised his pistol, and Jonas saw death approaching with the face of a fallen preacher. That's when Ellie Hartwell proved she was more than just a frightened child. The girl had been watching the fight from behind the water trough, her mind working with the same desperate clarity that had kept her siblings alive in the desert. While the adults fought and died around her, she'd been studying the burning stable structure with the keen eye of someone who'd learned survival from her father's stories. Tom Hartwell had been a bridge engineer before the gambling fever took him, and he told his daughter tales of controlled demolitions, of how a single support beam removed at the right moment could bring down an entire structure. Ellie had stored that knowledge away like water in a desert canteen, never knowing when she might need it. As Grim prepared to execute Jonas, she acted with the precision of an engineer's daughter. Grabbing a burning piece of wood from the scattered debris, she hurled it not at Grim, but at a specific point where the stable's main support beam met the wall, a connection weakened by fire and held together now by little more than charred hope. The impact was small, but it was enough. The weakened joint gave way with a crack like thunder, and the entire front wall of the stable began to collapse. But Ellie wasn't finished. She'd calculated the trajectory perfectly, and the falling timber created a domino effect that brought down a second beam directly above Frank Grimm. "I promise I'll save you," she screamed to Jonas, using her anchor phrase as she grabbed a piece of broken harness from the wreckage. The massive beam crashed down, but Grimm dove aside at the last second, the timber missing him by inches. However, the impact scattered burning debris everywhere, and one piece caught his coat sleeve, setting him ablaze. "Adios mio!" Carlos shouted, distracted by his boss's predicament. Ellie seized the moment, working with desperate efficiency to rig a lever using the harness and a sturdy piece of wood. It was crude engineering, but it worked at the timber pinning. Jonas shifted just enough for him to drag himself free, his legs screaming with pain, but still functional. "Smart girl." Jonas gasped, struggling to his feet. Your pa would be proud. But their troubles were far from over. Grim had rolled in the mud to extinguish the flames, and now he rose like a demon from hell, his clothes smoldering and his face twisted with rage that went beyond human reason. "You think you can thwart God's plan?" he shrieked, raising his pistol again. I'll send you all to judgment." That's when the third and most devastating twist revealed itself, not from the storm or the fire, but from a figure emerging through the smoke and chaos. "Drop the gun, you bastard." The voice belonged to Becca Hartwell, but this wasn't the broken woman who'd collapsed in the desert. She stood 20 feet away with a rifle in her hands, her eyes blazing with cold purpose that made even Grim step back. "Well, well." Slade laughed through his ruined face, blood streaming from his wounds. "Mama's come to play. You ain't got the spine for killing woman?" "You're wrong," Becca said quietly, her voice steady as stone. "I've been planning this for 3 years, ever since you murdered my husband." Jonas felt the world shift beneath him again. This went deeper than child trafficking and corrupt sheriffs. This was about old debts and older wounds. 3 years ago, you shot Tom Hartwell in the back during a card game in Tucson. Becca continued, her finger moving to the trigger. "Claimed he was cheating, but really, you just wanted his engineering money for yourself." Slade's grin faltered. "That was business. Man shouldn't play with money he can't afford to lose. He had the money. You murdered him for it. And then Grim used his death to create the debt that put my children in danger." Becca's eyes never wavered. Everything that happened, the threats, the abandonment, the lies, it all started with you putting a bullet in my husband's spine. The revelation hit Jonas like a physical blow. This wasn't random crime or desperate poverty. This was revenge years in the making, with 6 innocent children caught in the crossfire. "You orchestrated this whole thing," he realized. "I knew they'd send Slade to collect eventually. Knew he'd want the children for Grim's buyers." Becca's voice carried the weight of unbearable choices. "I had to wait for the right moment, had to get close enough to end him." "Mama." Ellie's voice was small, confused. "What are you saying?" "Your father didn't die in a mining accident, baby. He was murdered by this animal." Becca's voice cracked with 3 years of suppressed grief. "Everything I did, leaving you in the canyon, lying to save your lives, it was all to get close enough to kill the man who destroyed our family." Slade raised his gun, but Becca was faster. The rifle cracked once, and the big man staggered backward, clutching his chest. He tried to return fire, but his strength was fading like water in sand. "Tell the devil Tom Hartwell sent you," Becca said. Slade collapsed face first in the mud, and the secret that had driven Becca Hartwell to abandon her own children died with him. But Grim wasn't finished. With a roar of fanatic rage, he lunged forward, his remaining pistol aimed at Becca's heart. "You've defied God's will for the last time." The shot that ended Frank Grim's reign of corruption came from an unexpected source. Deputy Marshal Tom Morrison, who'd been working his way through the chaos, put a bullet through the false preacher's heart just as Grim's finger tightened on the trigger. Grim toppled backward, his eyes staring sightlessly at the storm-torn sky. His last words were a whispered prayer that might have been genuine repentance, or might have been a final blasphemy. The aftermath of the storm left Red Mesa looking like a battlefield painted by a mad artist. The livery stable was a smoking ruin, several buildings bore scars from wind and debris, and the main street was littered with the remnants of Frank Grim's criminal empire. Jonas sat on the steps of Dr. Morrison's clinic, while the old physician worked on his injuries. The fallen beam had bruised his legs badly, but broken nothing vital. More concerning was the bullet graze across his ribs and the exhaustion that came from fighting for his life in a sandstorm. "You'll live to hunt snakes another day," Dr. Morrison said, wrapping the wounds with clean cloth. "Though I'd recommend finding safer work." "What happens now?" Jonas asked, looking toward Deputy Marshal Tom Morrison, who stood nearby with his badge catching the first light of dawn. Morrison's face was grim, but not unsympathetic. "Officially, you're still wanted for killing my brother. But given what we've learned about his business dealings, He shrugged. Territory's got bigger problems than settling old scores. You testify about Grimm's operation, help us clean up this mess, and we'll call it even. Just like that. My brother made his choices. You made yours. Those children needed someone who gave a damn, and you stepped up. Morrison's voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. That counts for something in my book. Through the window, Jonas could see the 6 Hartwell children gathered in the clinic's front room. Dr. Morrison was checking them over, making sure their ordeal hadn't caused permanent damage. They were all alive altogether, and that had to count for something. But the emotional wounds would take longer to heal than the physical ones. Becca sat apart from her children, her face hollow with exhaustion, and something deeper, the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. She'd avenged her husband's murder, but the cost had been her relationship with the very children she'd tried to protect. What about her? Jonas asked, nodding toward Becca. That's between her and her family, Morrison replied. But if I had to guess, I'd say she's got a long road ahead. Trust once broken doesn't mend easy. The surviving members of Grimm's gang were either dead or in custody. Carlos had surrendered when surrounded by angry townspeople, and Pete had fled into the desert during the confusion, though his chances of survival were slim without water or supplies. The child trafficking network was completely dismantled, its records seized as evidence for trials that would echo through the territory. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Jonas found himself thinking about second chances and the true price of redemption. He'd spent 2 years running from the law, convinced he was beyond salvation. But maybe Morrison was right. Maybe the world was too complicated for simple justice. There's something else, Dr. Morrison said, finishing with the bandages. Found some papers in Grimm's safe. Looks like your father left you more than just hunting skills. He handed Jonas a deed yellowed with age, but still legal. Property in Colorado Territory, a small ranch with water rights and grazing land. Frank Grimm had acquired it through foreclosure after Jonas's father died, but the original deed had never been properly transferred. It's yours if you want it, Morrison said. Clean start, legal and proper. Jonas stared at the document, hardly believing what he was seeing. After years of drifting, of living day to day with nothing but what he could carry, he had a chance at something permanent, a place to build instead of just survive. But first, he had to deal with 6 children who'd become his responsibility whether he'd asked for it or not. The confrontation came 3 days later in the hotel room where Becca was staying while the territorial marshals sorted through the legal mess. She sat by the window, staring out at the desert that had nearly claimed her children's lives. They won't talk to me, she said without turning around. Can't say I blame them. Jonas studied her profile, seeing the resemblance to Ellie in the stubborn set of her jaw. You killed a man to avenge their father. That's got to count for something. I abandoned them to die in the desert. Everything else is just me trying to make myself feel better about it. She finally looked at him, her eyes red with unshed tears. What kind of mother leaves her babies for the buzzards? The kind who's been backed into a corner with no good choices, Jonas said. I've made my share of mistakes, Mrs. Hartwell. Sometimes the best you can do is try to make things right afterward. How do I make this right? How do I earn their forgiveness? Jonas was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his own failures and the weight of carrying them. Maybe you don't. Maybe you just have to live with what you did and try to be better going forward. They're better off without me. Ellie's got more sense than I ever did, and she loves them enough to protect them properly. Running away again won't fix anything. Becca's laugh was bitter as desert wind. What else am I supposed to do? Stay here and remind them every day of how I failed them? Before Jonas could answer, there was a soft knock at the door. Ellie stood in the hallway, her face solemn but determined. Can I talk to you, Mama, please? What followed was the hardest conversation Jonas had ever witnessed. Mother and daughter facing each other across a gulf of betrayal and pain, trying to find some way forward that didn't involve more loss. "I understand why you did it," Ellie said finally, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Understanding doesn't make it hurt less, but I get it. You loved Papa and that man took him away from us." Becca was crying now, years of guilt and rage pouring out in harsh sobs. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry I wasn't strong enough to find another way." "You were strong enough to save us in the end," Ellie said, taking her mother's hands. "That's got to count for something." "I promise I'll try to be better," Becca whispered. "I promise I'll earn your trust back. I promise I'll try to forgive you," Ellie replied, and Jonas heard the echo of the words she'd used to comfort her siblings. "But it's going to take time, Mama. A lot of time." They held each other, then two survivors of a war that had left scars on everyone it touched. Jonas slipped out of the room, giving them privacy for their reconciliation. It wouldn't be easy. Trust once broken was harder to rebuild than a burned stable. But it was a start. 2 months later, Jonas stood in the cemetery outside Red Mesa, watching Ellie place wildflowers on 3 graves. The first was marked with a simple wooden cross. Frank Grimm, 1831-1887, may God judge his soul. The second was newer fancier, Thomas Hartwell, beloved husband and father, 1844-1884, a good man, gone too soon. The third was unmarked, but everyone knew it belonged to Slade. "Why do you visit Grimm's grave?" Jonas asked. Ellie straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "Because someone should remember him. Not to honor him, but to remember what happens when good people let evil grow unchecked in their midst. She was wise beyond her years, this girl who'd held her family together through the worst storm of their lives. They all were in their own ways. Samuel had decided to study medicine with Dr. Morrison, showing a gift for healing that reminded Jonas of gentler times. The twins were thriving in the local school, their nightmares fading as they learned to trust again. Tommy still had his quiet moments, but he was gaining weight and learning to laugh. And Becca was trying. She'd rented a small house on the edge of town, taking in laundry and mending to support herself while she worked to rebuild her relationship with her children. It was slow-going progress measured in small moments and careful words, but healing was happening. "What about you?" Ellie asked. "When are you leaving for Colorado?" Jonas pulled out the deed that promised a new life, a chance to build something instead of just running from the past. He'd been carrying it for weeks, unable to make the final decision. "That depends," he said. "On whether you'd want to come with me." Ellie's eyes widened. "All of us, if you'll have me. Ranch is big enough for a family, got good water and plenty of room to grow. Could use some help getting it started." He paused and then added, "Your mama too, if she's willing to work for her second chance." For a moment, he thought she might cry. Then her face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the desert. "I promise we'll make it work," Ellie said, taking his scarred hand in her small one. "I promise we'll be a real family." "The family sticks together," Jonas agreed. "No matter what storms come." 6 months later, Deputy Marshal Tom Morrison received a letter postmarked from a small town near Denver. It was from Jonas Clay, reporting that the ranch was thriving and the children were all healthy and happy. Samuel was working with a local doctor and planning to attend medical school back east. The twins were top of their class and teaching other local children to read. Tommy had learned to ride a horse almost as big as he was and was showing promise as a rancher. Ellie had started a small school for frontier children, using the same fierce determination that had once kept her siblings alive in the desert. The letter mentioned that she'd been elected to the local school board at age 15, the youngest person ever to hold such a position in Colorado territory. Most remarkably, Becca had joined them in Colorado after Christmas, welcomed back by children who'd learned that forgiveness was sometimes stronger than pain. She was helping Ellie with the school and had started a small garden behind the house, growing things instead of just surviving. The letter included a photograph of 8 people standing in front of a white farmhouse, all of them smiling. On the back, in Ellie's careful handwriting, were words that said everything about the power of family and the possibility of redemption. We kept our promises. We made it home. Thank you for helping us find each other again. Morrison folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer next to the wanted poster for Jonas Clay that he'd never gotten around to filing. Some men deserved to be hunted. Others deserved a chance to prove they were better than their worst moments. In the end, the desert had tried to claim 6 children and failed. Frank Grimm had tried to destroy their innocence and died for his efforts. Slade had tried to escape justice and found it waiting for him in the form of a grieving widow's rifle. But Jonas Clay had chosen to be the man his father raised him to be. And Ellie Hartwell had chosen to lead her family toward light instead of darkness. In a harsh land where survival often meant abandoning others, they had chosen each other. And in Colorado territory, where the mountains touched the sky and the rivers ran clear, a ranch prospered under the care of a former snake hunter. 6 children who'd learned that family was something you chose to build and protect, and a woman who discovered that redemption was possible even after the worst mistakes. The desert still remembered them all, as deserts do, but this time it remembered survivors. And every year during the Festival of Desert Lights, the people of Red Mesa would hang blue lanterns in their windows and tell the story of the snake hunter who'd saved 6 lives and found his own salvation in the process. The buzzards that had once circled Dead Horse Canyon found other prey, and the desert wind carried new stories, tales of second chances and the unbreakable bonds that form when people choose love over fear, hope over despair, and family over everything else the world might take away. In the end, the greatest treasure hidden in the desert wasn't silver or gold, but the simple truth that sometimes the best families are the ones you build with your own hands, one promise at a time.